At the end of the 19th century, the district of Montmartre in the city of Paris was a whirlwind of entertainment and high living. It was bustling with cafes, bars and cabaret venues, such as the legendary Moulin Rouge. It was this twilight world that inspired one of the greatest artists of the age, Henri Toulouse Lautrec. Toulouse Lautrec adored the hedonistic Montmartre lifestyle. Every night he could be found drinking in the bars and clubs there. But this decadent lifestyle cut short a life that was already blighted by tragedy. As a child, his legs were crippled, leaving him physically stunted. As an adult, his love of alcohol spiraled into addiction, contributing to his death at just 36. But his great artistic achievements lived on. His paintings and his graphic works are now recognized as the work of a true master of the Post Impressionist age.
Toulouse Lautrec was the illustrator of the Belle Époque, really. His lithographs and prints just record the period, particularly, of course, around Montmartre, on the outskirts of Paris, the demi-monde and the nightlife there.
He was very instrumental in popularizing and developing the lithographic process of printmaking, and therefore the production of posters according to the lithographic process, which provided a freedom much freer than that which was available under the old etching and engraving methods, and which has, in many respects, has remained intact up to the present time.
Henri Toulouse Lautrec was born on Christmas Eve, 1864, at Albi, in the southwest of France. The Toulouse-Lautrecs were long-established aristocrats, and Henri spent his childhood in one of the many substantial family homes. His father was Count Alphonse Toulouse-Lautrec, an eccentric character who loved nothing more than going out riding and hunting. His son might have developed similarly aristocratic tastes, but when Henri was 14, he suffered the first of two accidents that would profoundly affect his life. At the family home in Albi, he fell on a slippery floor and broke his right leg. A year later, his left leg was also badly fractured in a fall. These were minor accidents in themselves, but the teenage Henri suffered from poorly developed bones. The injuries failed to heal properly, and the implications for his body were severe. His stunted legs became disproportionately small compared with his fully developed upper body. The injuries were crippling, and he could no longer walk unsupported. An outdoor lifestyle like his father's was out of the question. But Lautrec had shown signs of his real life's passion even before his misfortune. Within his family, there was already an artistic tradition. Both his father and his grandfather were skilled draftsmen, and the young Henri had learnt how to draw. His childhood notebooks are filled with speedily executed images, many of them depicting horses. After his injuries, he devoted himself more and more to his art. His father appointed a family friend as his tutor, a man who also painted equestrian subjects, René Princeteau. With this background, it's not surprising that horses should feature in this very early Lautrec painting, created when the artist was just 16. Here we see Alphonse Toulouse-Lautrec driving a coach and four. Though technically flawed, this is a significant work, since it reveals the young artist's passion for a compositional feature that would characterize his more mature masterpieces, a strong sense of movement.
I think it's true to say that when you look at his work, most of it, if not all of it, is concerned with the human figure in movement or in repose, but nevertheless the human figure. How far this interest was fueled by his own lack of ability, whether that was part of his interest, one doesn't know. Yes, one suspects that yes, it was. But whether in envy or pity or what, we don't know. It is certainly that he was able to convey human beings at repose and in movement in a brilliant way.
He certainly was able to capture movement in his pictures of the dancers and in his paintings of the horses, the jockeys and riders. And he did this mainly through his linear abilities. Very, very energetic.
Early paintings such as this helped Lautrec to persuade his parents that he was serious about a career as an artist. So, in 1882, he moved to Paris to begin his formal training. He was already a more than capable portraitist.
The artists of that period, the late 19th century, of which the Post Impressionists and people like Toulouse Lautrec existed, was moving away from the formal art school training, the academy training, for many people. If you look at his work, it is based upon a thorough knowledge and understanding of the human form as understood through really a rather academic study to art school training. And that is fundamental to his work, I believe. It gives a strength to his work. So that whatever manipulation he gives, it is not so out of proportion that it's impossible.
In March 1882, he became a pupil of the history painter Léon Bonnel. Shortly afterwards, a fellow student painted this portrait of the young Lautrec at work. He worked hard at his studies, firstly with Bonnard and then with Fernand Comment, another painter of formal historical scenes. Although the young Lautrec did not share his tutor's enthusiasm for historical subject matter, his time with them certainly benefited his art.
Here he learnt how to discipline his very lively line, his very lively approach, and to observe accurately and put this down on paper rather than caricature everything. He had a tendency to caricature, and that was modified by his training in Paris. And also in Coment's atelier, he met Van Gogh and Bernard. During his time in Paris at the beginning and continually after that, he was very, very impressed by Degas and learnt a lot from Degas and continually wanted Degas' approval of his work.
Lautrec greatly admired the work of Edgar Degas, and he was keen to use the same contemporary subject matter as the older artist.
What he learnt from Degas was techniques derived from Japanese painting, where there's a lot of use of the diagonal and empty spaces and solid colour surrounded by quite severe outline. He also took this from Bernard and Gauguin.
This small portrait also reveals the influence of another Impressionist master. Painted in 1886, this is an image of the young artist Émile Bernard, painted by Lautrec in the unmistakable manner of Auguste Renoir.
For any artist coming to Paris during the second part of the 19th century, the left bank of the River Seine was a magnet for artists from all over. It was a great maelstrom of creative ideas, of visual awareness, ad hoc exhibitions, complete lack of formality, enthusiasm, and above all, I believe, a freedom of colour and of form and of line.
Paris was home to artists whose work was even more radical than that of the Impressionists. In 1886, Lautrec was introduced to one of them, a 33-year-old Dutch painter then in residence at Fernand Coment's studio. His name was Vincent van Gogh. The two men got on well, and this 1887 portrait of Vincent shows clearly how Toulouse-Lautrec responded to the artistic thinking of his fellow painter.
What Toulouse-Lautrec liked about Van Gogh was his honesty, his directness, and his subject matter of the café, basically. He also maybe took from Van Gogh the cross-hatching that Van Gogh used in his paint Toulouse-Lautrec used this in his prints as well as his pictures. And his colour to some degree as well. Toulouse-Lautrec's colour was quite unusual. Yellows, acidy yellows and pinks and strange combinations, which he could have derived inspiration for from Van Gogh.
Van Gogh's influence upon Lautrec was fleeting, however. The two men were very different characters and very different artists. Shortly after sitting for this portrait, Vincent left to pursue his solitary artistic vision in the south of France. By contrast, Lautrec had already established himself in the very heart of Parisian social life. It was here that he would live and work, and it was this small district that would provide the principal subject matter for that work, Montmartre. In the late 19th century, Montmartre was the location for an overwhelming number of cabarets, nightclubs, cafes and bars. This was the so-called Belle Époque, the beautiful age, a time of prosperity, entertainment and indulgence. It was this nocturnal society that inspired the greatest work of Toulouse-Lautrec.
Rich gentlemen from Russia, from America, from England, from Germany would all come to Paris, perhaps have their business meetings during the day, and then hop off to Montmartre and have a good time at night. So there's plenty of money flowing around. It was the end, the fin de siècle, the decadent society. All of this is perfectly applicable to that part of Paris at that time, although to apply it to the rest of Paris I think would be wrong. But yes, but it was a rich human seedbed for artists. For one thing, things were cheap there. You got cheap accommodation, which was very useful. There was a lack of formality. And there was simply vivaciousness and the love of life. And I think that was what was there. Yes, there was plenty on offer.
By 1886, Toulouse-Lautrec had established himself in Montmartre. He rented a flat and a studio in the district and immersed himself into the bohemian lifestyle. Every night he took advantage of the cabaret clubs on offer. One such club was Le Merliton, an establishment whose proprietor was the singer Aristide Bruant. In the 1890s, Bruant posed for some of Lautrec's greatest graphic works. Prior to this, he helped the artist by allowing him space within Le Merliton to exhibit his early professional paintings. Many of them were depictions of scenes from inside Montmartre clubs. In the mid-1880s, the most famous of all these establishments was the Moulin de la Galette, a venue which had already inspired one of the greatest of all paintings by Renoir. In 1889, Lautrec also adopted the subject. But this is clearly a very different kind of painting. The artist's mature artistic identity was now revealing itself.
In the Moulin de la Galette, we have a sense of the objectivity and the slight distance which Toulouse-Lautrec had from his subject matter, like Degas, in fact. On the right-hand side, at the front, there is a strong diagonal of empty space, and those people themselves are observers looking into the picture at the dancers. And on the left of them, there is another empty space. So we're sort of doubly removed from what's going on. And the figures who are closest to us typically don't have any contact with each other. Then they don't have eye contact. They seem sad, isolated. And this too is typical of some of Toulouse-Lautrec's later work.
The things which seemed to be a particular concern to him at the beginning seemed also to be a particular concern to him at the end. And it was a concern with the human being, not the human condition like Munch or Van Gogh, but it really the ethos, the setting, and it was life. It seems to me that most of his stuff was, in essence, a celebration of life. Perhaps he was trying to make up for his own problems, and of course he did sort of abuse his body through alcohol and all sorts of things, and died comparatively young. But nevertheless, there is this joy of life which comes through. There is also a melancholy. And this is echoed in other artists like Degas, for instance.
To create a painting such as this, the artist typically drew sketches as he drank into the night. He would then produce the final canvas in his studio during the day. At this stage, Lautrec's lifestyle did not affect his ability to work prodigiously hard. As well as scenes of Montmartre nightlife, he also painted a wonderful series of portraits, including an 1889 canvas, Red-Haired Woman with a White Jacket. It is a deeply touching image, a study in reflective femininity, and the model's beauty only adds to the emotional quality of the work. There is a similar quality in this earlier painting, one of 4 Lautrec portraits that depict the model Rosa LaRouge. A memorable work in itself, it is also an image that has unfortunate significance when considering the artist's fate. It was from this young woman that Lautrec contracted syphilis, an ailment that would plague him for the rest of his life and that would contribute to his early death. Toulouse-Lautrec never married, and he was unable to form a long-lasting relationship with anyone. Many women did find him attractive, including the stunningly beautiful artist Suzanne Valadon. A passionate affair took place between them, and Lautrec painted his lover, but perhaps it is this 1889 drawing of Suzanne that is more noteworthy. The work is entitled The Drinker or the Morning After, which shows the artist's enthusiasm for line drawing. Throughout his career, a strong linear element characterized Lautrec's work, to the extent that in many of his paintings he literally drew with his brush.
The linear dimension in Lautrec's work is very important. It's almost his trademark. He was an extraordinary draftsman. His interest was first aroused by illustrations, black and white. So he learned early on the importance of the line, and his line is very vivacious, lively, and very evocative.
The use of the outline, the use of the, if you like, the calligraphic stroke, the flowing line, the flowing black line for that matter in many cases, and a line which stands on its own, is not dependent upon anything else, or an area of colour which is almost a line and it fluctuates and flows. It's a very calligraphic, a very linear approach. And that is extremely important, yes, and it transposed very easily onto printmaking techniques like lithography, which is a free printmaking technique, which you can make those flowing lines.
By the age of 25, Lautrec was a well-known figure in Montmartre, a regular at many cabaret clubs, including one which opened in 1889 and which quickly became the most famous of them all, the Red Windmill, the Moulin Rouge. This was, quite simply, a pleasure palace, an enormous establishment featuring all kinds of entertainment. There was music and singing and dancing, but the real attractions were prostitutes and strong liquor. The Moulin Rouge became the most famous night spot in the world, and Lautrec loved it. It was this one venue that also contributed most to the artist's own fame, which was confirmed in 1891. He had already enjoyed some professional success, though his family wealth meant that he did not have to concern himself too much with selling his work. In 1888, he exhibited with the Brussels-based avant-garde artists known as the 20. The following year, works by Lautrec featured for the first time in the so-called Salon des Indépendants. In artistic circles, his paintings were increasingly well known. But what eventually secured a wider fame was not a painting at all. It was this, an 1891 work intended to promote the venue that the artist appreciated so much. This is La Galou, a lithographic poster.
It was the La Galou poster of 1891 that made him famous, in fact. And it shows how his technique was revolutionary. in that he simplified his subject matter and made it very decorative at the same time. In the foreground of La Goulou, you have the shape of a man, a silhouette, in dark grey, of her companion, of La Goulou's companion. And this, although it's not the main subject matter, leads us into, because just beyond him, you have La Goulou herself in her cream dress and knickerbockers doing the can-can. And it's a very bright, light area as contrasted with the grey of the man. And also her actions are very contrasting to his. He's just smoking a cigarette, she's doing the can-can. Beyond her, there are the silhouettes of people watching her, men in top hats mostly, and a few women. And then beyond that, there are the lights, and then there's the writing. So the whole thing is actually very simple forms, quite clearly outlined and often in solid colour.
La Goulou, meaning glutton, was the stage name of Louis Weber, one of the most popular professional dancers at the Moulin Rouge. Here we see her in high-kicking action as the dramatically silhouetted figure of her fellow dancer, Valentin Le Dessarcey, looks on.
One great boost to places, the cabarets like Moulin de la Galette, proved to be the posters of Toulouse Lautrec. There seemed to be a mix which came through, which was to be able to convey in very simple terms and very cheaply the excitement and enthusiasm and delights that were in store for you if you went to the Moulin de la Galette or wherever else he was advertising. La Goulou, which was one of the dancers, seemed to embody, at the time, and it seems to us to embody because it's a brilliant piece of work, the spirit which is so exciting. There it is visually, colour and this linear quality. And that is what exciting this is, you know. Oh my goodness me, this is a place to go to. So I think it's important. It's quite simple, but behind it is this complete mastery of this new technique of lithography and the whole business of the poster. He really went into printmaking, and he worked night and day. I mean, he didn't hand it over to a printmaker. He actually went into the printmaker studios, worked on the stones, and worked there until his prints were produced.
This was the first of over 24 Lautrec posters. The following year, he created this image showing William Warrener, an English friend of the artist, enjoying himself at the Moulin Rouge. Here, we again see the graphic artist's powerful handling of line, but we also see an expanded colour scheme and a totally new technique, whose effects we can see on the young woman's dress. By splattering paint onto the lithographic stone with a toothbrush, Lautrec was able to produce this innovative speckled effect, just one feature of his revolutionary poster work.
The term poster, as we understand it in this century, the 20th century, is entirely dependent upon the work of Toulouse-Lautrec in the late 19th century. Posters of an earlier period, and they continued of course, but posters of an earlier period had been printed typefaces of varying sorts. The typical Victorian one was of a variety of different types of typeface, large, small, ornate, and so on. Here we get something which is a picture. In other words, the information is conveyed by a picture, the minimum of lettering. It is, in other words, a work of art. The whole approach is that of a work of art.
This image features the cabaret star Jane Avril, enjoying a performance by another leading performer of the day, Yvette Gilbert, a woman who is identifiable by her long black gloves. Although images like this appear simple, they were in no way hurried. Lautrec was painstaking about his graphic work. An expert draftsman, he impressed his printers by arriving in the morning to supervise the production process while still in his evening dress from the night before. In the early 1890s, that night before would normally have involved a visit to the Moulin Rouge. But we should not imagine that this was entirely hedonistic. As we have seen, Lautrec's preparatory drawings were often made on the premises as he drank. The final image was created during the day. This 1890 painting of A Dance at the Moulin Rouge is a typical Lautrec creation of the time. With an image like this, we can see the artist as the visual documenter of his age, These are all real individuals, well known to Lautrec. The dancers themselves are Valentin Dessaussay and La Goulou. Between them, in the background, is the performer Jane Avril, while nearby is the artist's own aging father. This sense of visual documentary was entirely deliberate. Lautrec sought to capture the immediacy of a given moment, but this was the result of detailed preliminary work. The distribution of the component figures here is especially well balanced, a mastery of composition that we also see in the most famous of all Lautrec's Moulin Rouge images, simply entitled At the Moulin Rouge.
The figures are a music critic, a Spanish dancer, a photographer, and his friend Maurice Gilbert. Beyond this first group that we can see is Toulouse-Lautrec himself with his cousin, his tall cousin. And then beyond them to the right, there is La Goulou with her female partner and friend. It's like a family scene, really, in a way, for Toulouse-Lautrec.
Again, Lautrec presents the viewer with a snapshot of Moulin Rouge life. But this painting is more than just a documentary image. It is a virtuoso work whose arrangement and colouring in particular reveal an artist at the peak of his powers. It remains one of the greatest works of the Post Impressionist age.
One of the strange things about this picture is the figure on the right, which is cut off, which is an idea he could have got from Degas or from photography, and the dramatic lighting of her face is extraordinary and reflects the effects of gaslighting, in fact, on the stage. But she's quite a dramatic figure and leads us into the painting.
The most prominent feature is the face on the right-hand side, which actually wasn't there in the original painting. It was a strip of canvas added later and that painted on, which means that your visual reading of the work changes dramatically. If you cut out that right-hand side, then you look at the painting as it was originally. You are, if you like, moving around within and around. When you look at the later one with the added piece of canvas, and then immediately your eye swings to that as your first primary point of interest, and everything else is seen as in relation to that.
At the Moulin Rouge was painted in the middle of an extraordinarily productive period of the artist's life. His poster commissions included a memorable 1892 image promoting the singer Aristide Bruant. Lautrec also maintained a formidable output of paintings depicting the Montmartre performers he knew so well. Here we see Jane Avril leaving the Moulin Rouge with a pensive, off-stage expression, similar to the expression on La Goulou's face as she arrives at the same famous establishment. We can also appreciate the artist's bold use of cropping to the left of the painting. By cutting off half this woman's face, Lautrec reveals his admiration for the Japanese prints that were popular amongst French artists of the day. The technique adds to the immediacy of this captured instant of Montmartre life in 1892.
Lautrec saw an exhibition of Japanese prints in 1883 and he began collecting them. So from an early stage he was fascinated by them. What he particularly liked about them was the flat areas of colour outlined quite clearly in black and the decorative effect that these had. He also enjoyed the sense of space introduced often by diagonals, and he was aware of the very carefully chosen point of view that would present the subject as clearly and dramatically as possible to the onlooker, and this was something that he used in his own works as well, often a high point of view. For example, in the Moulin Rouge, where we have a very high viewpoint looking down on the scene.
The influence of Japanese prints had an effect upon a number of artists. Toulouse Lautrec was interested, partly because it was printmaking. Therefore you're working on the block on a flat surface, which meant that that restricted the type of image that you could produce, both in colour-wise, field colour, but also in the linear quality. But it was precisely this ability to use the restrictions of the media which encouraged Toulouse Lautrec, and he did that with lithography. He so understood that medium that he made it move to what he wanted to do, which is exactly what the Japanese printmakers had done with their block printing. And it was that areas of plain colour, of a non-European, non-Renaissance approach to depth and space.
It is nightlife pictures such as this that we most associate with Lautrec today. He has been rightly referred to as the documenter of Montmartre, but by the time he painted this portrait, he was spending far less time in the Montmartre district. He was now displaying signs of full-blown alcoholism, and his syphilis was also an increasing source of concern. Though not yet 30 years old, his health was beginning to fail. Perhaps in response to this, he spent increasingly long periods in the company of women, but not in the context of romantic relationships. Instead, he sought out the pleasures of the Paris brothel. If the status of the so-called dancers who worked in the Montmartre cabaret clubs was dubious, then the status of the girls in the brothels of central Paris was beyond any shadow of doubt. These were professional prostitutes, and during the mid-1890s, Toulouse-Lautrec increasingly sought out their services. At famous establishments, such as the one on the Rue des Moulins, he went as far as to actually live on the premises, as though residing at a gentleman's club. We might consider this to be reckless behavior for a man already sick with venereal disease, but there can be no doubting the artistic legacy of Lautrec's brothel years. The paintings that he created were remarkable. Lautrec was deeply concerned about his unfortunate physical appearance. It's true that he was often able to laugh his disability off, and his fine self-caricatures can be seen as part of this process. But he did feel different from other members of his own wealthy social class. His immersion in the dubious nightlife of Montmartre was almost certainly a reaction to this. And it was perhaps this awareness of life on the fringes of society that made his portraits of Parisian working girls so full of sensitivity and sympathy. These paintings capture the remarkably mundane existence that lay behind the exotic public face of the Paris brothel. The girls themselves can be seen engaged in routine, ordinary activity, such as preparing their hair, eating, or playing cards.
The technical methods which were used by artists were beginning to change quite dramatically during the 19th century. It was the introduction of new materials. I suppose the obvious one is the introduction of new paints, and of course the fact that the paint tube was invented so that you could buy ready mixed paints.
It was not unusual for academic painters to use cardboard for their sketches, and they used a very turpentine oil wash, in fact. Toulouse-Lautrec used cardboard for his sketches, but he also used it for some of his small finished works. There might be another reason why he used the cardboard, and it could be because it's the same sort of colour as stone. So if he was designing something later to be as a lithograph, he might have found it useful to be using the same colour background as the stone itself.
What happens when you paint upon that sort of surface is that it soaks in, becomes matte, and very much like a print. So you can create what is almost a sort of print-like quality, but it isn't, it's a painting. He was not the only one that used that. I mean, after all, Constable used cardboard at the beginning of the century, but people like Degas also used it. It was the absorbent quality which was helpful. It gave a shortness and a dryness to the paint and a flatness, which to both Degas and to Toulouse Lautrec they found useful and exciting.
This is the Salon at the Rue des Moulins, a painting that opens the door to one of the best known of all Parisian brothels.
This painting of 1894 is the culmination of his series of brothel paintings. He actually took a room in this brothel and lived there, so it was easy for him to catch the women relaxing and behaving perfectly normally. And in fact, the woman in the front of the painting with her leg bent was apparently one of his favourite women, one of his friends, perhaps, who actually went to Argentina, presumably as a prostitute. Again, this painting is his usual format of diagonal, leading the eye in. We're not isolated quite so much from the figures as we are in some of the other works. The colour is very striking, of course, in this painting, reflecting the Moroccan theme of this particular room where the prostitutes waited for their clients.
The strong linear element is again apparent, but this is a far more painterly image than much of Lautrec's 1890s work. It is executed on canvas and richly coloured, conveying an impression of plush, velvety elegance. But this was nothing more than an illusion. The creator of this painting once said that his artistic aim was to depict the true and not the ideal. With this one painting, he achieved his aim triumphantly.
If we look at some of the later works like the Salon, we are entering, first of all, it's a world in which Toulouse Lautrec was part of. He was part of the furniture. Sounds a strange thing to say. But one of his aims was to become so part of, not the clientele so much as the everyday objects within the club, the brothel, whatever it might be. Catching them off guard, just as Degas was doing with some of his dances. So in that sense, I think it's very important. But it goes a little bit further than that, because it is a natural study. You feel it's a study in individuals, but as ordinary human beings, not as a facade which the customers, the clients, will be faced with.
This single 1894 image is now recognised as one of the greatest achievements of the post-impressionist age. But at the time, there were few who fully appreciated the value of Lautrec's formal painting. He was known primarily as a graphic artist, and his posters could be seen all over Paris, a public status that the artist found deeply satisfying. This is an example of Lautrec's graphic work dating from 1895, an advertisement for a stylish arts magazine with which the artist had long been associated. This is also a poster advertisement printed the following year, promoting a brand of English bicycle chain. This was the age when cycling was establishing itself as a popular leisure activity. Just 7 years after this image was created, the first ever Tour de France took place. Lautrec was also keen on the new pastime, and the late 1890s saw him associating with the pioneer racing cyclists of the day. He also developed a passion for the theatre and opera, and he had always loved the circus, as we can detect in this image created when the artist was just 23. At the Circus Fernando was probably Lautrec's first truly successful attempt at conveying a strong sense of movement in a full-blown painting. 11 years later, in 1899, he returned to the theme in a powerful series of drawings. These are impressive achievements in themselves, but the creation of this series of 50 or so images was the direct result of his tragic final decline. By the beginning of 1899, the artist was a shadow of his former self. He was now hardly working at all. He lived the life of a hard, aggressive, syphilitic drunk. Eyewitness accounts describe how he spent entire days alone in a wine merchant's shop, drinking himself into a stupor. It couldn't last. In February 1899, he was struck down by the condition that the alcoholic fears most, delirium tremens. At the insistence of his mother, he was immediately committed to a secure mental hospital, and it was behind locked doors that the famous circus drawings were created.
He looked back several years to work he'd done previously at the circus, and he created about 40 pictures of the circus. So they were imaginative reinterpretations, in fact, of previous work. And they're quite formalised and traditional in some ways, unusual for Lautrec.
They were part of his rehabilitation. Once he'd sobered up, he sought to prove to the hospital authorities that he was of sound mind. To do this, he decided to show them that his artistic skills were still intact. The circus drawings were the result. They were inspired by a memory that was obviously still functioning. And so, in May 1899, Lautrec was released from hospital. "I bought my freedom with these drawings," was what the artist said afterwards.
I think they tell us more about his own frame of mind, unsettled. I don't think, in a sense, they lead on to as much as, for instance, his posters at the Moulin de l'Oeillette and so forth did. They seem to me to be harking backward a bit, showing a sense of unease.
Following his release from hospital, Lautrec seemed to make a recovery. His mother employed a family friend to act as his minder and to keep him away from alcohol. For a while, it seemed to work. He returned to his painting, and in the summer of 1899, he produced this vivid, cheerful portrait of an Englishwoman in Le Havre. It seemed as if the artist had recovered from his illness. Sadly, it was not to be. This portrait, created the following year, is far more significant. Known as The Milliner, it is an unmistakably gloomy image, entirely out of keeping for a Lautrec painting. And in this canvas, the Faculty of Medicine examination, we see an even stronger sense of somberness. Perhaps the most significant feature of this image is its date. This is the last painting of the artist's life, and its darkness suggests that Lautrec knew the end was near. In summer 1901, Lautrec suffered a stroke. To convalesce, he was taken to his mother's home on the coast near Bordeaux. For a time, he seemed to recover, and he was able to work on this final painting of his cousin Gabrielle, presenting an examination paper. But there would be no escape from the consequences of a lifetime of drinking and wild living.
Well, I'm not sure he pursued it intentionally. It just so happened that the subject matter he was interested in was on show mainly at night, and he actually worked on it during the day, so he was burning the candle at both ends from that point of view. He also maintained a perfectly normal lifestyle. He stayed in touch with his cousins, with his family. He wasn't totally absorbed in the nightlife of Montmartre.
Toulouse-Lautrec died on the 9th of September 1901, aged just 36. To this day, admirers of his work wonder why an artist of such genius could consciously pursue such a self-destructive lifestyle. Some have gone so far as to describe his entire life as a kind of protracted living suicide.
One of the, if you like, the tragedies of Toulouse-Lautrec's, Henri's life was, in a sense, he was doomed from as soon as he broke his legs, but on the island before that, because he had inherited this weakness. And I think he foresaw the end and decided he would live life as madly and as richly as he could. And he got into it. And that was it. His frame couldn't eventually take it. He just overwhelmed it.
We cannot tell how the art of Toulouse-Lautrec might have evolved had he lived into middle age. We might think of his early death as yet another example of the great artist dead before his time. But perhaps we should instead appreciate what he was able to achieve. With his Montmartre works, his portraits, his brothel scenes, and his graphic work, he created a body of remarkable artistic achievement. A century after his death, the sheer size of that achievement is undisputed.
He was the originator of the modern poster, and the modern means of communication, for instance, cinema, advertising. And if we think of our posters during the last 100 years, they owe it to Toulouse-Lautrec.
Toulouse-Lautrec today is regarded primarily as a poster painter of great vivacity and summing up the Belle Époque. But if you look at his other works, they show an enormous sensitivity. So apart from his more obvious public works, he's done a lot of private works which are very sensitive and true and completely honest.